Okay, I think we're able to start. So welcome to this webinar where the IFOL Education Panel will be discussing some of the key challenges in accounts payable and procure to pay and sharing the best practice with you, which you can apply in your workplace. For those who aren't members or students with us already, our education panel are our experts and they're responsible for delivering live virtual masterclasses each month for our members and students. And we'll be providing you with a best practice guide following this session, so there's no need to make any notes. Please do put any questions, as I've said, that you have in the chat. We'll pick them up as we go along, and we'll also be running a couple of polls as we go along, and we'd ask you to vote in those, please. So I'm Sue Beardsmore, and I'm joined by our panel of experts today, all with considerable experience in the field, the IFOL Education Panel. We've got with us Caroline Adams, and she has over 20 years experience in shared services as a senior finance manager and in IT. She's built teams and led them through really significant change and is particularly focused on payables. She's also aware of the importance of getting the appropriate resources to support procure to pay within an organization, and that's sometimes a bit of a struggle. Deborah Richardson, joining us from the US, has over 20 years of experience in AP, AR, general ledger and financial reporting for Fortune 500 companies, including Verizon, General Motors and Aramark. For 10 years, she focused on global vendor maintenance, concentrating on authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practice to prevent fraud in the vendor master file. She now focuses on helping accounts payable teams protect the vendor master file from fraud, and she also has significant experience of moving manual systems to automated systems. Gary Stevens, been involved in finance in private and public sector for over 40 years, for 25 years served with Aberdeen City Council, and as financial services manager there, one of his responsibilities was for accounts payable. But he led a transformation project which delivered efficiencies and improvement in performance, and in just 3 years delivered a really award-winning accounts payable team. He now works with organizations to develop their accounts payable to strengthen performance. Rod Chadwick will be joining us for the automation discussion a bit later on. He's an accountant by training, holding senior roles for 25 years, and as head of process improvement at the Royal Mail, Rod was in charge of their automation strategy, which delivered a return on investment running into millions. Right, straight away, welcome to the panel. Thanks very much indeed. But we're going to start with a poll. So the poll's going up, and it is, has your business or a business you know experienced fraud in the last 18 months? Just a simple yes or no. And while you're deciding on that, I'm just going to turn to our panel and ask them a few initial thoughts, because after 18 months of disruption, there have been huge changes, both forced and voluntary. Fraud's always an issue, of course, but what are the latest threats and challenges that you're coming across? Perhaps we'll start with Caroline. What have you been hearing about?
Yeah, two specific areas, Sue. One is about the lack of ability to contact people face to face or on the phone, which opens up both frustrations and opportunities. And then the second one really is all about procurement and having to use the internet for more frequently for purchasing a wider variety of items, and that again in itself opens up the opportunity for weakened controls and processes.
Okay, we'll come to that in a moment or two and maybe look at some of the things people can do to protect themselves. Deborah, what are you coming across?
Yeah, so still the same business email compromise. And while the FBI's 2020 report of internet crime saw a slight decrease in the number of incidents reported during 2020, what they also found is that the average loss increased. So the number of incidents decreased, but the average loss increased. In addition to that, email account takeover. So all of the phishing attempts that we've been seeing for the past few years, they increased in 2020, of course, has been successful. And so the result of that is that the fraudsters have been able to get those valid login credentials so that when you receive those emails, they are from your boss's email, they are from your vendor's legitimate email account, and that just makes it harder to identify fraudulent emails.
Okay, we'll come back to those. Gary, do you have anything to add right up front?
I would just add that I think there is definitely, as a result of the pandemic, an increase on pressure to pay suppliers quicker, particularly in public sector. They are paying a lot of payments out to individuals, for example, for grants. So those grants are needed quickly to keep individuals and small businesses going. So there's a lot of pressure on AP teams to get those payments out. So obviously there's more opportunity for fraudsters to take advantage of that. And I think a lot of suppliers' databases have been inactive for so long. So there's an opportunity there again for some of those inactive suppliers to maybe have their data transferred over to a fraudster and used, for example. So there's definitely potential for fraud within that. And there's just a general increase in invoices coming in as well, since things are starting to get back to normal. So that's more pressure on your AP teams as well.
Okay, well, we'll look at examples that you'll have of those things and maybe what people can, well, definitely what people can do to protect themselves. The results of the poll, yes, 42% have actually knowledge of fraud in their business or someone they know, and 58% no. So just under half are saying that they've experienced it, which is, pretty high rate really. So let's come to those subjects, maybe take them in turn in the order that we mentioned them. The lack of ability to contact people. Now, are there specific examples that you've come across of that, Caroline, and what can people do to protect themselves?
Yeah. What I always use is the good old, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. And it's about, how do you know who you're talking to, whether it be via email, on the phone, on the internet, whatever, chat box, whatever. How do you know who you're actually talking to? Because the fraudsters are always trying to get ahead of the game and find new ways. And the latest one that we heard only less than 4 weeks ago is that they're now using voice mimicking. So contacting an AP manager or whoever in the payments area and playing the part of the CFO or the finance director directing to make a payment. And that blew me away when I heard about that, because I thought, wow, that's new again and leading us off into a completely different direction. But I think it's always been difficult to know who you're talking to, and then unless you've got named individuals held in your accounting systems, I don't think you ever know truly who you're talking to.
So what should people do to protect themselves? Always make the contact from them. Yeah.
So never respond to the email. Always make either a new email or a new contact, or a team meeting, or whichever way you can, using your own internal controls, and make contact through that route. But certainly the last 18 months has been very difficult from a contact and from a customer and supplier's perspective as well.
Does anybody want to add anything on that particular point?
I just think staff need to be vigilant and wary, even more so just now. And training staff as well. The experienced staff will know some of these things are the tricks that are going on, but keep them aware of the new frauds that are coming through. The one that Caroline mentioned is very scary. You might have an AP person who gets an email from the CEO, doesn't think anything else of it, deals with it because it's the CEO. You've got to challenge.
Okay.
If you're not sure.
Yeah. And that sort of takes us a little bit to email compromise, doesn't it, Deborah? The point that you raised. Perhaps you'd tell us a few examples of that and what people should be doing and looking out for.
Yeah, it does. And so I'm talking about email account takeover, where the fraudsters do have the legitimate, the login credentials. So they are in your boss's legitimate email. They are in your vendor's legitimate email, and they're sending you these requests to make changes to their remittance information, to their virtual vendors payments. And so the big thing I think that you can do is to make sure that you always apply authentication techniques. Well, what do we mean by that? So the same way that when you contact your bank, they authenticate who you are, they just don't talk to you about whatever it is you're calling in to talk about. They will first have you identify 2 to 3 pieces of critical data to make sure you are who you say you are. And you need to do the same thing with your vendors. So identify 2 to 3 pieces of information that only the vendor or someone at the vendor's place of business would know. And then once you identify who's requesting that information, also authenticate the data. And what does that mean? That means that if they are asking to change a bank account, make sure that they give you the existing bank account. And if they don't have it, push back. Because think about it, if they don't have the existing bank account, if they don't have the authority to get the existing bank account, how do they have the authority to have you change the bank account? So keep that in mind. Treat your vendors the same way your bank treats you, and make sure you authenticate them and you authenticate the data that they're giving you.
Okay.
Just touching on that last point, Deborah, I mean, in my team, if we had a change of bank details, we wrote back to the supplier and we were requesting what their old bank details were. Yes. And that's where they have the difficulties.
Yes.
The fraudsters won't always be able to get hold of that. So they had to provide that and to make it bona fide. Yeah.
And email account takeover. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, and that's again kind of the same thing. You can't control, the fact that the fraudsters have been able to infiltrate your vendor's email or your boss's email. That's not something you can control, but you can control how you treat that email and whether or not you authenticate that requester, and then also the data.
Yeah, because if you follow your process and your controls, it should take you down the path that you follow, and not go off at a different tangent. So eyes forward, eyes on the prize.
You brought up their processes and controls, and of course one of the things that you've mentioned previously is that with all the changes there have been and people having to make changes very quickly over the past 18 months, the processes and controls, in some cases internal, what have you, gone out the window. So what should people be doing now? Gary, I think that was, touched on one of the things that you brought up. What should people be doing at this stage? They've had a turbulent 18 months. What can they be doing now?
I think, as Caroline mentioned, they need to get their eye back on the ball and follow those processes and procedures. Yes, there's a pressure to pay, but you have to be making sure that those payments are going out the door correctly. Yes, you've got things available to you like forensic software that will help to check your payment runs before they go out the door to make sure that you're not duplicating invoices and things like that. Very important part of your AP process and software. So things like that can help, but just making sure that those processes and procedures are followed, staff are fully aware of them and are fully trained up. And obviously segregation of duties is important. We make sure that you haven't got staff who are processing invoices in the morning and then paying them out in the afternoon.
Yeah.
So again, that's a very important thing to be looking at too.
But it's about looking back over, because the pandemic happened and we all had to go and work remotely, which, let's be fair, working in finance, not many people were allowed to do that previously. So that was a huge culture change. But it's also about looking back at some of those short, sharp decisions and changes that you had to make and go back and review. And it could be, follow the controls and reviewing the controls anyway, but it's a continuous program of going back and looking and saying, does that look right? Have we done everything possible to ensure that the weaknesses have been addressed in the change that we've had to make? Even if it's down to short payment terms, are the controls strong enough for that process to make sure you can make those, and that you're not having to look backwards afterwards, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So
I think as well, work with your audit departments to review those processes and procedures. Every AB department will be audited at least once a year. So that's an opportunity to review those processes and procedures, do your walkthrough tests, make sure everything's being followed properly through the whole procure to pay process.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think I agree. This is a perfect time to start looking back at those things that you may have done when you abruptly, right? AP abruptly had to go home. And that can include, giving certain people access. Maybe the person that did a particular position wasn't able to get up and running as quickly as someone else. So you gave them access where they didn't have access before. And so I think it's a perfect time to implement the least privilege access, which means that you only give security access to those that absolutely need it, and go back now and do that security role, security access audit, so that you can catch those things or those scenarios where you did give someone access just because it was a short-term fix to getting things done and up and running really quickly. It's a perfect time to go back and do that security audit, and just keep that security audit as something that you do periodically, if not quarterly, then semi-annually.
And Caroline, you mentioned that people working from home. Well, of course, we're not out of this pandemic yet. That will continue as a way of working, won't it? So what if people have to work from home, if staff have to work from home, what should people be looking at to make that more secure?
Obviously, looking at your laptop security, number one. But for me personally, I think it's all about communication, and that, we're talking about controls, fraud, processes, but it's about when you come across a new fraud, it's about making sure that your team and other people within the organization know about that new fraud, so that you're doing a continual education program, and also about reporting it. So like you say, working from home is not going to change, but it's how we button down the hatches, review, and making sure that we're continually talking to our teams, making sure they're involved, educating them, reducing the access. It all ties in together, really.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, because, sharing out, if you experience a fraudulent email, make sure you don't send the email, but maybe share a snapshot or a snippet of what that email looks like, because if one team member got it, then it's a high probability that many other team members receive that same thing. And then make sure, again, you're talking about it. If you have, weekly meetings, make sure you have a section that's like a part of your permanent agenda that's just to talk about fraud. And that can include sharing those frauds that they've experienced or that they've maybe seen on other alerts, so that everyone is aware.
Yeah, you'll never stop. We talk about working from home. On your phones, I'm sure everybody's had the text messages that are flying around at the moment. I won't name and shame some of the companies' names that they're using, but go and pay the postage on this, click on this, do that. It is so easy to click on a link and let the fraudsters in, and I'll put my hand up. I got scammed at Christmas, and it was very unpleasant. And someone as experienced as me, I was really, really cross with myself. But they caught me at a busy time. So anyone can fall for it very easily.
So perhaps that's what you're all saying. I mean, the pressures of working differently, working with different systems, changing things quickly, you still can't afford to ignore all the processes that the professionals know about and not be tempted to sort of bypass them. Caroline, you mentioned procurement. Is there anything, there are examples there of good practice or things that have gone wrong that you'd like to bring up?
I think Gary is quite good on this one, because it's really, we're talking about the public sector, and PPE purchasing is a very good example. Gary, do you want to?
Well, yeah, sorry to jump in. Yeah, there have been examples of public sector procurements getting caught out with the PPI, putting in orders for bogus PPI equipment that didn't even exist, being charged over the odds, contracts being arranged that are over the odds for what they should be paying, and maybe that person getting a kickback on that order, things like that. So procurement fraud is now definitely on the increase, absolutely. That's, you know, it's very difficult in some ways to actually control that fraud. If you've got collusion inside, you could have two people, for example, colluding in the business to put orders through higher than you should be, getting kickbacks and things like that. So I think procurement fraud in the public sector is a very difficult area to deal with. But again, it's reviewing some of the spend that's going through the supplier base. You know, is there spikes in spend, for example? Have they been spending a level amount through most of the year, and all of a sudden you see a huge payment going through? Those sort of things need to be investigated. Make sure your procure to pay process is robust. So you've got the budget holder who is authorizing the purchase order. Every invoice should have a purchase order. No PO, no pay policy should be in place as well to try and combat some of the procurement fraud that's going on.
There's also the scam websites now as well. And
There
you know,
is, yeah.
I'm not highly technical on these things, but it is so easy for them to imitate the real McCoy, and before you know it, you've been hooked in and are purchasing from not the right company. And I just think with technology and how easy it is to, you know, put a picture of Sue Beardsmore on something, you know, and do something with that itself, they're just very, very clever.
So,
Yeah.
Deborah, sorry, yeah, carry on.
Sorry. Yeah, and I was going to say on that, these spoofed, you know, domains, these cyber criminals, the fraudsters are, you know, they go to work every day just like you and I, trying to figure out how they can get over on us. And as Caroline talked about, they're creating these fake websites to trick you, right, into either purchasing something from them or inputting your login credentials. So again, they get your login credentials. One of the things you can do though, if you are suspicious about a site is, and I'll put it in the chat, you can check whois.com. And if you put in that address domain, it will bring you back and it'll actually have lots of information, but what you're really interested in is that create date, that site create date. So if you think you're dealing with a Microsoft or an Apple, right, you expect to see a registration date or create date, you know, long time ago, back in the 80s, right? But if you see that the registration date or the create date was 2 months ago, now you know that's a red flag. So that's one way that you can add to your toolkit to look at, to try to see if who you're dealing with or the site that you're dealing with is legitimate.
Thank you.
And it's also usually there's bad grammar and spelling mistakes.
Yeah.
You can normally pick something up if you're looking for it, is what I would say.
Yeah, and what's funny though is I saw on some alert or some website that they're actually, again, these fraudsters, right, cyber criminals are running a business just like, you know, legitimate businesses, and they put an advertisement out for English speakers so that they can make sure that in the future they're clearing up those grammatical errors and that context, right? So that we think that just to trick us even more to think that we're actually dealing with legitimate vendor or someone, legitimate person in our organization.
And of course, procurement, particularly worldwide shortages of various things, as with PPE at the beginning of the pandemic, people can be bounced into going, putting in the order without doing those checks just because they're so desperate to get things.
Especially
happening.
Yeah, especially as we get closer to the holidays and they're already talking about shortages. Yeah.
So still
in the supply chain.
Take care. Okay, we're going to have a hi, Rod. Thanks for joining us. It's Good
Hi, how you doing?
We'll speak to you soon. But first of all, a little poll. How confident are you, everybody out there, in your processes and procedures to mitigate the risk of fraud? How confident are you in your company, be it big or small, in your processes and procedures to mitigate the risk of fraud, given what we've just been listening to, the things that everybody is looking out for? But how sure are you that you are mitigating against them? So if you would vote in that, that would be great. Just take a moment. So that's 1, you're not confident at all that you've got things covered, up to you feel that there's no room improvement, in a 5. So if you could vote in that, we'll have a little look at that result in a moment or two, and we'll move on. I mean, fraud generally, and some of the things has touched on cybersecurity, but perhaps we could look at what's going on more specifically out there. I think we've Deborah, perhaps you'd like to take us through some of the things that you regard as cybersecurity, lack of it. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so for cybersecurity, again, this is a big area. One thing I will say is that this week in particular is Cybersecurity Awareness Week, at least here in the US, and it's put on by a couple of different organizations. And what I really like about it is that this year, and this is the 5th year, they are really focusing on different areas for each week. And this week, they are focusing on cybersecurity careers, and they recognize that there is a lack of cybersecurity educated personnel out there, and we really do need to have that to try and combat the ever-evolving increased threats in cybersecurity.
Sue, you're on
Yeah,
mute,
no,
Sue.
good to look out for. Thank you very much. Somebody had to do it, so it might as well be me. But have you come across specific examples? And apart from, you know, that general wariness and looking out for things, what can people actually do?
So I like the authentication piece where I talked about authenticating the requester and authenticating the data. But the other piece of that is validation, right? And let's talk about, you know, you get these vendors in your vendor master file, you onboard them, and at the time maybe you do your validations, which should include the watch list validations, but don't ignore those vendors once they get into your vendor master file. And Gary, I think you said that, right? So you've got your vendors data in your vendor master file, you're paying them, maybe you're not, maybe you haven't used them in a few months, but make sure you continue to validate that data to make sure nothing has changed, to make sure that they haven't, you know, appeared on these watch lists since you last onboarded them or last checked or checked them last. And then if they've been inactive for any amount of time, go ahead and inactivate that vendor so that vendor is no longer accessible in your vendor master file for both external or internal fraud. So if a fraudster tries to, you know, impersonate a vendor that's inactive, that's going to be a big red flag for you.
Gary, Caroline, would you like to come
in? You know, I talked on about referred to that, you know, the fraudsters doing the verbal pay instruction, and there is a very, very simple solution to that, in that you don't have a verbal pay instruction in your AP policies and procedures, and you get sign off from the CFO and the board that you will follow your again, I know we keep banging on about processes, procedures, controls, but if you don't have a verbal instruction, then there is no way in for the fraudster. So that is a very simple, quick fix, because anybody working in AP will know that there are always urgent payments, and there are always things that, you know, have come from nowhere where you have to make a same day payment perhaps. And again, the only way to ensure that you are paying who you say you are is to cleanse your supplier master file, as Deborah has just said, to make sure that you're validating your suppliers. And that is, and again, you know, I learned something new quite recently about the new legislation that came in about supplier risk management. And that is exactly what Deborah was saying. It's about making sure that you're only using legitimate people and not dealing with people from countries that are banned or different marketplaces for different things. But it's all about common sense, and if it doesn't feel right, don't do it.
Okay.
That's always the bottom line, isn't it, really? If it doesn't feel right, don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and can I also say I loved what Caroline said about, you know, eliminate, you know, that contact, that verbal request, because I will tell you, working with, you know, Fortune 15, Fortune 200 companies, as a senior manager, I was never contacted, right, by the CEO to have an urgent payment. And so that expectation should just be removed, so that if a team member receives that type of a request, it itself is a red flag.
Mm-hmm.
The results of the poll, 3/4 are fairly confident that they mitigate against the risk of fraud. Some, just one not confident, but nobody thinks that there's no room for improvement. So it's well worth tips and hints to do all that. So are there any other recently come across phishing, vishing, I think you mentioned, Deborah, or smishing? I mean, I just love the 3 words,
Yeah,
but they're all not good words. So is
great.
there any examples you'd like to bring up and highlight?
Yeah, so for smishing, especially in the US, you see a lot of it. And this is, it can be on a business level. So Department of Motor Vehicles for every state, every month, it's another state where the fraudsters are sending out these text messages related to registered vehicles, which if you have registered vehicles for your company, you could receive one of those too. So here in the States, smishing is just running rampant, both at the business level and at the consumer level as well.
Okay, a question just come up in the chat. You mentioned no PO, no pay policy, which Olga's organization, Olga's put the question in, thanks very much indeed. So her organization has that, but can you speak what are some of the best practices surrounding handling non-PO related transactions? They're usually mainly handled via the AP payment request form and approved via email, according to the delegation of authority, now that we're working remotely. But how can we mitigate against fraud in this area? Any more suggestions? Who would like to?
Well, in the council, when I was with the council, we still, even though we were moving as much as we could to automation, we still had around about 15% of our invoices coming in without purchase orders. So we regularly, or every month, we reviewed exactly why those orders were being raised without a purchase order. And it was literally a naming and shaming exercise. We put it back to the directorates to say these people have raised orders, and why is the budget holder or the requisitioner actually okaying these? Because what they had to do was, we had a workflow system. So you had to identify firstly who was likely to have raised the order. And then you had to send that to the budget holder to actually input the budget code that it was going to get paid against through that automated workflow system. So you were able to pick up a thread there and then question with the budget holder, well, why has your requisition not gone through the proper process? And if you have we had 3 hits and you were out, we stopped that requisitioner from being able to raise any purchase orders or putting any orders through without POs. And it could be a disciplinary issue in some cases if they were very high value.
I don't think you can ever eliminate.
You'll never eliminate it. No.
Yeah, and there are certain types of spend where you're never going to have.
Yeah, I was just coming to that. Yeah.
Oh, I'll let you go on then, Gary.
Sorry. Yeah, there are types of spend which you know, for example, you might have insurance renewals, you have your utilities, things like that will come in without purchase orders. So you have to expect that. And we actually put a list around of the spend which was acceptable to not have a purchase order, and it wasn't very huge. I mean, most things that you purchase, you should have a purchase order. You can put that through your procurement portal. So the list was quite short. So definitely a review on a monthly basis of who's raising it. Raise it with the directorate or the senior management of that particular department, and try to get the buy-in from them to stop it happening. As Caroline said, you'll never get it to zero, but you can work hard to try and get it to as low as you possibly can, because it also delays payment to the supplier. The other way is to tell the supplier that, you know, you're not going to get paid if you don't give us a purchase order number, or there will be severe delays in you getting paid. And they don't want that either.
There's another angle to that as well. If there isn't a purchase order, you can't see the commitment. You don't know that cash is needed from a cash flow perspective out of payables to pay that supplier. And also there might not be the budget for it. So from a business perspective, you would want that on a procurement or purchasing system. And I would be escalating, like Gary says, to, you know, head of, director, or whatever, about why this area of the business hasn't got purchase orders, and getting them on board and selling all the reasons why they should be using purchase orders.
Yeah, and I agree with that too. Even at, you know, a large company in the US, it's still the same thing. We would review those invoices that came in that were out of compliance with our purchase order policy, and go back to those requesters and their leadership and discuss and identify why they're doing it, because that's the only way you're going to get them to have that behavior change.
Okay, before we move on to automation, it's good to have you there, Rod. Want to use your expertise. We've had a couple more quick questions in the chat, so let's deal with those now, and then we'll take automation on to the end of the session. So is it worth to have PO created after the invoices come in, or should the requesters and AP team work on a solid non-PO process and policies to tackle any potential issues? Brief answer to that, anybody?
Yeah, definitely. We didn't encourage retrospective purchase orders because of your budget monitoring and all of that type of thing that Caroline touched on.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So I'm sure we could carry on for the whole hour about fraud, but we're going to move on to automation now, and pick your brains on that one, and especially pick Rod Chadwick's brains. But before we do, another brief poll. How would you describe the level of automation in AP or P2P in your organization? Whatever you understand by it, whatever part of it, would you describe it as no automation at all, right up to fully automated? And we'll have a look at the result of that in a moment or two. But we'll get on with Rod. So can you tell us about what you did with RPA? And I have, for me, written down robotic process automation. I'm sure everybody out there knows exactly what that means, but I thought I needed to check, at Royal Mail, and the benefits that you saw of it. And the poll, for your information, to know who you're talking to, says 50% partially automated, nobody fully automated, and just one with no automation at all. So that's the spread that we're looking at there.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Yeah, indeed. So yeah, thanks, Sue. Yes, I spent 35 years working at Royal Mail, and just left recently. Well, sort of 6 months ago. And the last 4 years there, after a series of finance roles, I'm a senior accountant by training for about the last 25 years. I had the opportunity to get involved in this new thing called RPA. Myself and two colleagues, we persuaded one of the senior directors to allow us to start having a look at it on a very small scale initially. So we did some proof of concept work, essentially, just off the back of a laptop, one developer. We did 3 trial robots to see how it would work, 2 within finance and 1 within HR. So the finance ones were one in receivables, one in payables. So it was customer setup, supplier, and supplier setup. And we were looking at frontline recruitment in HR. The 2 finance ones were really successful and worked very well. The HR one was an absolute disaster, but we learned an awful lot from it. So I over the last sort of few years, I've certainly found all the ways of not doing it correctly and all the lessons therein. But we proved that the concept would work. And for those that don't really know what RPA is, it's best way to describe it is any sort of set of transactions that you can do with a mouse or a keyboard. You can put rules around it. You can automate it. And it's a similar principle to like a macro in Excel that you'll all be familiar with, but it works across all different applications. So, you might get an email that comes into your company. You might have a file attached to it. You might extract that file, take some data from it, check it against another file, input it to another system, run a report, email that report back to somebody else, those sort of things. As long as you can put rules around it, you can get a robot to do all of that transactional work for you. So it is very powerful when used in the right circumstances. So following the successful proof of concept, we did a business case to essentially set up a centre of excellence, an automation centre of excellence within Royal Mail, totally sort of self-contained and fully staffed internally. And over the last sort of 3.5 years, got a long story short, we got to a position where we had about 85 automations live in the organisation across 6 different functions. So it started largely in finance, but we had them in operations, in fleet, in customer experience, commercial. And so it's not just a finance thing, it's just that finance just tend to lend itself to it. And typically in an organisation, the finance people tend to drive it. So you tend to start with what you know. So that's usually why it often gets sort of conflated with being a finance thing, but it can work in anywhere you've got a system.
Okay. And what particular benefits did you see? I mean, Royal Mail, huge organisation. We'll go on to talk about different sizes and who might approach it and why they want it with the rest of the panel. But what particular benefits did you see in your project, Rod?
So it just in terms of the hard line stuff, I mean, we ended up with an ROI of about 400% on it. So it was a very, very successful, financially successful project, tens of millions in terms of benefits delivered. But I think you have to have a very good idea of what success looks like for your organisation and why you're doing it. That's the first thing. And for people that sort of have a preconception around something like this, that it's just about sort of getting rid of jobs, taking roles out and doing it with fewer people. Certainly in my experience, that's not really where the big benefit lies, because a lot of the tasks that you're automating tend to be at the very transactional level. So, the money that you might save, for example, by taking a couple of heads out, tend to be at the lower end of the salary scale as a rule. And actually, by freeing those people's times up to do something more productive, your actual bottom line benefit can be significantly higher. And I think it's a really important point to really understand what it is that you want to get out of it before you start, because your whole communication side of it and change management aspect of it is driven by, getting people on board. And if turkeys don't vote for Christmas, do they? If you're going to go out there and tell people you're going to get rid of 30% of the staff, you're not going to get much support in terms of actually making the change stick and get it implemented. So, and personally, I think that's a short-sighted approach anyway. You've got much bigger benefits on revenue protection, for example, on the controls that you can put in place, on the customer journey, speed to market, all those things. But you have to be a little bit more creative with some of those things to actually put a value on it. So it needs thinking about before you embark.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Rod. So to the panel generally, and perhaps you'd all join in, for those looking into automating, where should they start? Where could they start? Who wants to start on that one?
Well, I could tell you where we started, and to give you perhaps some examples, if this is an audience that does P2P and AP, perhaps some real examples of things that we've done in that area. So customer setup is a very good example. It's a transactional thing, so you can as long as you've got the information there, you can automate that. Interestingly, just touching on something that you mentioned in respect to the controls around vendors. We had an issue where we had a long tail, as it was called, a long vendor tail, where you've got literally thousands of vendors on the system that you've not used for a long time. And actually maintaining that master data is something where you can use automation and a robot to help you do that. So we built a robot that actually went in and checked, and you put parameters around it and say, okay, tell me all the vendors that we haven't used in the last 12 months or 18 months or whatever parameter you want to put on it. The robot would go in, extract that information, and then you can also then link it to another one that says, okay, once you're happy with that, set your parameters and say, right, deactivate that tail. So you've only got the ones that are current that you're actually doing business with at that time. So that's another one that isn't an obvious thing to think about, but you can easily do. And then something like the more mundane of closing purchase orders. So we always had a problem of actually closing purchase orders. What tended to happen and I'm sure it's anybody that's in a big company, you get to month end, everyone focuses on the big ones. Yeah, so the ones that are likely to get spotted by the auditors, the ones that have got the big numbers associated with them. What that tends to leave you with is thousands and thousands of purchase orders that are probably still carrying accruals, relatively small ones. So again, what we did there was we built a robot that said, okay, tell us which ones you want to close. Just give us a purchase order number and a line item. The robot will go in, pick that information up, close the purchase order, tell somebody that, and send an email back to say it's been done. But the next stage you can take from that is you can use it as part of your control and say, well, okay, now you've got that. How about you say, I'm going to go out and say, right, all these that you set your parameters, all the ones I want to know, all the ones that are more than 6 months old that have since they had an invoice, and go back to the people who raised them and say, unless you can come back with a very good reason why not, we're going to close this purchase order down. So you change it from a pull to a push, and you can use it as part of your month-end control procedure, so that you're not continually carrying lots of accruals and tying up cash in the business that can be used for something else.
Okay, thanks, Rod, for those examples. Deborah, I know that you've got big experience of this. You'd like to come in.
Yeah, and what I like to say to start with is, one, whenever you bring in automation, your whole team is, wondering what's going to happen to their job. And so I did this as a senior manager, brought in a huge project. It was a vendor self-registration portal. I had a team of 17 that was entering in requests. And so they were all wondering, right, now that the vendor is going to do it, or for the most part is going to do that, what's going to happen in my job? And so we used robotics process automation, or RPA, to see, one, what manual processes we could automate, because everyone has manual processes that they either, are just kind of a chore to do, or that they forget to do. We have those too, and see which of those manual processes are eligible for RPA. And then on the other side, I was able to upskill, a couple of team members to learn RPA, right, to learn how to implement that. And I also had another person that went and identified all those manual projects. And so I eventually brought them all together to say, here's our list of manual projects. Let's see if any of those are eligible now that, I have team members that know RPA and how to implement it. Here are the ones that are eligible for that. And so I was able to upskill some of those team members so that they didn't have to worry about losing positions. And quite frankly, I didn't have to worry about losing positions, because you guys know, once an AP position is eliminated, it is hard to get that back. So you need to find other value added activities for those personnel, and RPA is one of them.
Hey, Caroline, Gary, would you like to?
I want to take it back a little bit
Okay.
to the basics, in that not everyone is at RPA or AI in their process automation. Some people are at the start of the journey. And I'm touching on something that Rod said, which is it's about knowing what you want to achieve before you start. So as a business, accounts payable, P2P, we all want to be highly automated and to bring in RPA. But it's also about, if you work for a retailer like I did, it's all the investment is focused at the front door, not necessarily at the back door for finance systems. So you've got a fight on your hands before you even start. So it's about understanding what the business strategy is and ensuring that the proposal that you're putting together supports what that strategy is, whether it's cost saving, and that's not necessarily headcount, and people shouldn't be afraid of that. It's about efficiencies and making things better to work on other things, or it could be a working capital project. It could be a number of different things, but it's about going back to basics, and your start point is looking at your processes. So you can automate a bad process, and what you'll end up with isn't an efficiency, it will be a mess. So it is about tiny steps, knowing what you're trying to achieve, and then sometimes you have to pause, look back at what you've done, and you might have to change what going forward looks like, and the journey that you're going to go on. So to me, it is about going back to basics first.
I completely agree. I mean, it's a good point that you make about the processes. Our program was called the Process Simplification and Automation Program, deliberately in that order, because an awful lot of benefits can be had just from looking at stuff with a lean sort of toolkit, a lean mindset, to say, well, actually, you know, simplify, standardize, eliminate before you even think of automating something. So yeah, completely agree, because it's a great tool, but if you use it in the wrong circumstances, you'll just be doing the same rubbish quicker, which, you know, is not what you want to do.
I think for me, when I took on the role in 2007 of looking at my council's AP, as I said earlier, our payment performance was very, very poor. There's 32 councils in Scotland. We were about 27, 28. And for a big council, that wasn't good enough. One of the drivers for me was that we have to look after our supplier base. They weren't getting paid on time. Less than 80% were getting paid on time. And a lot of those suppliers are small to medium companies, local companies. So you want to get that money paid to them so it can regenerate itself in the local economy. So that was a big driver for me. But similar to what Caroline was saying, you know, I just had to look at how we were going to go on a journey and where I had to identify, if you like, some small, quick wins, even just centralizing the team, getting a centralized team of people in to one building, so all the invoices could go in there centrally, and you can then start building up that expertise within that team. And then a workflow system. We didn't know where our invoices were from one day to the next, sitting on people's desks. So we got a workflow system to underpin what that centralized team were doing. And from there, once that gets settled down, we could then start to look at the automation side of things, which is what we moved on to, OCR, e-invoicing, and then I jumped ship once that was in. But we were up to paying from about less than 80% of our suppliers to about 98% of our suppliers were getting paid within a 30-day term, out with those invoices that were in dispute. So we were top of the tree, and it was a good place to be. And it kept, as I said, it kept our supplier base happy as well. They were getting the benefit of that. And on the back of that, you could bring in things like prompt payment discounts. So all that hard-earned effort and work that you've put in, you'll get something on the back of it by introducing something like that.
Are there any differences, may I ask, in the process or what you need to do depending on the size of an organization, or is it always fundamentally the same?
I think the principles are always the same. You know, it's no different, and the size and scale just tends to impact on, you know, the business case that you're putting together, and then the structures that you then put in place to actually maintain this estate that you're going to build. So, you know, very few companies actually get to scale when they start out on an RPA journey. It's you know, low single digits actually, which is quite surprising. And I think part of that is because they don't have a firm understanding or a firm plan of how, once you start building these things, how you're then actually going to maintain them and maintain that estate. You know, and there's a quote by Kurt Vonnegut that says that, you know, a flaw in the human character is that everybody wants to build and nobody wants to maintain. And it's true with RPA, because it's all very exciting when you start building these things. It's great fun, you know, it's everyone's enjoying it. But then actually somebody's got to think about, okay, now we need a change management process and an incident process, and what we're going to do when they break down, and what's the support to, what's the SLAs going to be, and how, you know, all these sorts of things that you've got to think about. And that's to get to scaling, to have it as an integrated part of your work and your actual structure. Those things need to be thought about, and in a lot of depth, because, you know, otherwise it's just something that you do that kind of is on the fringes. Whereas, you know, if you're going to really have it as part of a genuine digital transformation, you've got to make it front and center, and you know, treat it accordingly.
But by doing your RPA programs as well, I don't think people should lose the sight of. It gets rid of a lot of the mundane tasks that we all have in our jobs, but it allows you to go on to the exciting things, like, the data that AP is sat on is a treasure trove. And, looking at your data insights, your dashboards, it's, that's where you can add value by reporting back to the business about what they can do with that data and what's it telling them, be it from a working capital, a procurement strategy, a payment strategy. It's, there's just all these possibilities, but you're too busy passing something from A to B and ticking a box. So that's where the excitement comes for the teams, from doing some of the mundane drudgery, is what I would say politely.
And for people that are early on in their automation journey, you don't have to do everything at once, do you? We're not talking about looking at the whole thing.
You can't really. You've got to have a plan, and it's a 3 to 4 year plan in some cases. And take those, especially if you're in a large organisation as we were, where we had to bring together a number of departments. You can't just do it all in one go. You've got to take little bite-sized chunks to get there, little steps. And I just like to say, I said I jumped ship. I didn't want to get the wrong impression. I took early retirement.
Well, we're winding towards the end of our hour's session. So just before we go, perhaps I could ask you to look into your crystal balls. How do you see automation going in the future, in the short term, if you like, not too long term? Any big changes?
So, I mean, what my main observation is just the sheer pace that the technology is moving at is phenomenal. And part of the battle when you start out on this sort of journey is actually keeping pace with it and understanding how you can best use it. Because what you're doing today, 12 months time, you can probably find a better way of doing it. So you've always kind of got to have one eye on the future. People talk about AI, talk about having it as something that's genuinely intelligent automation, as opposed to sort of just basic transactional automation. And the ways of doing that are becoming increasingly cheap and available. I mean, we started looking at it, did some proof of concept work, and we didn't take it much further because it was prohibitively expensive. And those algorithms that you need to build to sort of do that machine learning, some of those are available for free now.
So keep one eye down the road. Deborah, what are you thinking?
Yeah, and so I would say no matter what AP automation project you have, if it includes your internal team members, make sure you bring them in and you keep them updated on that project, because if it's going to involve your vendors, they're the ones that have the relationships with your vendors, and they're the ones that are going to make or break them using, right? They're going to have a big effect on vendor adoption. Okay. So I think automation is going to be huge, and you need to make sure you bring in your internal team members so they can help push it with your vendors.
Thank you. Caroline, briefly.
Very quickly, continuous development program, and keep your eye out for risks and risk management.
Yeah. Gary, final word.
Yeah, I would agree with what Caroline said. I think the AP staff's role is going to change dramatically over the next few years. They're completely away from transactional processing, more benefit work to address some of the issues we've spoken about today in areas like fraud, even supplier liaison, things like that.
Thank you very much. So thanks to the whole panel of experts, Caroline Adams, Deborah Richardson, Gary Stevens and Rod Chadwick. And thanks to you for joining us. A very quick feedback survey will pop up for you at the end of this session, so please do take part. For more information on membership and courses, head to the IFOL website. And this webinar will be available on demand on the IFOL website from tomorrow. So please feel free to share with any colleagues or friends who you feel may benefit from watching. And we'll send a link to top suggestions and a PDF best practice guide to all those that have registered. Thanks again for joining us.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.